Joe Benson here to chat with him. Let's give him a really warm welcome.
Thank you. Lita and I go back to when.
Sit on the table. Long time.
You know, actually, yeah, this is when we were doing.
Martinello and Sino?
Yep, we were doing Uncle Joe's record guide.
Record guides.
Maybe next year we'll do that again. I also want to, as we get things going here, point out that my long-suffering producer who's been working with me for over 14 years is in here, and it's not often she gets out in public because of that parole thing. But Stacy Perry is here. Would you please give her a hand for? This is going to be fun on a number of levels, and let me point out, it's fun hanging with Ken Scott, just for the hell of it, much less for the stories that come up.
Fun hanging out. Is this working?
It should be.
It's fun hanging out with Joe as well. So he always trips me up. He knows things from books where the people say I did that I don't remember in the slightest. So I'm waiting to see what he's come up with today to trip me up.
It was the 4th of May in 19...
I do remember that.
This guy, we're all... The cool thing here is we're hanging with a cool guy who's been around a cool stuff for a long time, but there's very few people who have worked with the Beatles. Very few people have worked with the Beatles and David Bowie, and lived to tell about it, and worked with Elton John, and worked with Supertramp and all that, and he has been the source. Well, he's not the creative source of the music behind it, but the way it sounds, the way it comes across, and the way it connects with us. And that's what I want to tap into in the limited time we have here tonight, after spending 6 hours in the parking lot. The book is called Abbey Road to Ziggy Stardust, and that's actually, it's a lot more than just those 2 reference points.
Yeah, but we had to get the A to Z. That was
it's a problem.
What can I say? It's all down to.
Did you actually start out as a child? Did you have any musical training whatsoever? Is there music in your family?
No music in the family. I took piano lessons for maybe 9 months and hated playing scales the entire time. So I wanted to get onto the real thing, and I couldn't with the piano teacher I had. I tried to remember his name, but
I can name a nun that was responsible for that.
Yeah.
Sounds like somebody else can too. There we go. But I'm not going to right now. She probably still got something for me. I think it's interesting. The story, the book goes through Ken's story working with all these musicians and how he got started. And I can tell by the wide spectrum of people of ages we have here.
Excuse me 1 second. I love the way it's working with all these stars or artists, and then he gets started. It's as if I've worked with a lot of people before I actually got started.
Well, actually, you worked with a lot of people before you, but that's the normal way to get a job. I mean, all of us, when I grew up, when I was 15 or 16, well, I was trying to tie my shoes mainly. But you think about things you can do, might want to do, and you were interested in recording to some degree, evidently. Sure. And you decided one day, how old were you, 15, 16? You decided one day you wanted to go to work at Abbey Road Studios.
No.
No?
I wanted to work anywhere that needed a recording engineer.
Anywhere?
Anywhere. And so one Friday, I got fed up with school. One Friday evening, I wrote to everywhere I could find in the phone book, which was maybe 10 places. Radio stations, TV stations, film companies, and guess what, record companies. And so I wrote on the Friday, mailed them out on the Saturday, heard from one of them on the Tuesday, had the interview on the Wednesday, was accepted on the Friday, left school that day, and started the following Monday. So within 9 days of my getting fed up with school, I started what became the most well-known recording studio in the world. At the time it was EMI Recording Studios, and eventually got changed to Abbey Road Studios.
Did you know anything about engineering other than how to spell it?
Sweet, I think.
And for those of you, the reference is he used the posts. It's kind of like an email, only it's written on paper and you put it in an envelope in a mailbox.
Well, in English, it's Sweet Fanny Adams.
It's what?
Sweet Fanny Adams.
Sweet Fanny Adams. Can I ask why?
Oh, it's just FA. It's the easier way of, so you don't offend people. And this was before Beatles, which is great.
So you start work at the studios where the Beatles are recorded?
Actually, not quite. Very, very soon afterwards. Within 2 weeks, I started off in the tape library, which is where they started off everyone, because you got to know how the studio worked. Because because you were getting tapes from one place to another. You got to know the staff, you got to know what went on, you got to know what an editor was, what a master, what a cutter was. Back then, today it's a mastering engineer. All of these different things. And there was one day, the first instance, within 2 weeks of my starting there, I'm booking tapes in, and I get this 1-inch 4-track tape that came in from Pathé Marconi Studios in Paris. And I'm looking at it, and it's the Beatles, and one of the titles is Can't Buy Me Love.
This was the master tape they just recorded in Paris.
Yeah, absolutely. And, oh my God, I've got a Beatles tape in my hand. Then 2 weeks later, I'm carrying tapes from, I think it was number 3 studio up to the tape library, walking along the corridor, and they're coming towards me with the 2 Georges, Harrison and Martin. And at that particular time, there were a whole bunch of girls outside, young girls, that were Beatles fans, and they were screaming their heads off. And as soon as I saw the 2 Georges, I wanted to scream my head off, just like the little girls. Luckily, I bit my tongue and walked up to the tape library, and then,
They had that aura about them, even at that point.
oh, they were huge. In England, they were huge. Yeah, absolutely. This was, they were in there recording Hard Day's Night, so it was interesting.
Were they filming at the same time they were recording?
No, they recorded side 1, which was all of the film material first, then they recorded. Then, of course, I get promoted from the tape library to what at the time was called a button pusher, and it was called that because that's all we
Pray
did.
tell what a button pusher is.
It's exactly what you think.
Those darn Brits.
I just hit play or record or rewind. I just hit buttons. I push buttons. These days it's called a second engineer. And the first session that I'm ever a second engineer on, button pusher, is side 2 of the Hard Day's Night.
That's exactly how I felt when I read it. At this point in time, you're just trying to keep quiet and keep your job in the background. Trying to stay in the background.
Well, keep my job, just about, yeah. Too many occasions when that almost didn't happen.
That's one of the things about the book, which is perfect Christmas gift. Let me just mention that early on here. It goes through chronological order, and there's little sidebars, not only in the mechanical and technical end of things, to keep you abreast of that, but also things that were going on time-wise in the studio, and as you were working your way up to learn how to do things like that. And I love that part of it, and some of the little stories that rolled in. At that point, when you're seeing the Beatles record, you're actually working with them for the first time. Were they paying any attention to you? Were they just in their own world? Were they...
Yeah, they were very much in their own world, but you also have to remember that at the time when I started, EMI Studios had 3 studios, but they only had 2 4-track machines. And so the 2 4-track machines were in completely separate rooms. So it was great working on a Beatles session. You would somewhere down the corridor, and you'd hear every now and again through this little speaker, okay, we're going to go on to this title and let's record. And so you weren't really a part of it. But
You were there as it was being created.
absolutely.
Were they stumbling when the songs worked out when they started?
To a point. To the point. There were times when Sir George would, well, let's try it this way, let's do that kind of thing. But they by the time I started to work with them on Hard Day's Night, they were getting it together very well.
Besides working with the Beatles while you're working for EMI Studios, there's other bands coming in as well. You weren't just working solely with the Beatles.
No, the first number one single I ever worked on as a second engineer was Do What Did He by Madrid Man. Worked with Peter and Gordon, Billy J. Kramer, Dakota's Jackie DeShannon.
Jackie DeShannon was still is a beautiful American woman, songwriter, astounding songwriter, a great musician. She came out here. She's originally from Illinois, Indiana, and then Kentucky. Unique style of guitar playing. Came out and worked with the Wrecking Crew, the most famous session people there were. She worked with the very best, and went over to England for whatever reason. Ended up working with you, and she had problems with one of the guitar players, didn't she?
That one of the things that I tried to do with the book was I wanted it to be as close to the truth as possible, because I have had dealings with other books where I've been very vocal about their honesty, let's put it that way. So one of the things I wanted to do was get other people that had been around at the time involved and asked them what they remembered. Well, there was this story about this session with Jackie DeShannon that was really firmly implanted at the back of my brain. And I wanted to make sure that the way I remembered it was correct. So it just so happened someone that's going to be here, I think in a couple of days, a gentleman by the name of Seth Swirsky, had this movie coming out. I was invited to go and see it, and one of the people that was going to be there was Jackie DeShannon. So I thought, perfect. So I got my co-writer, Bobby Osinski, who's sitting over at the back there, I believe, yes.
This is the first time he sat quietly in a long time.
Of course. I'm waiting for him to ask a question, because you know that one's going to be hard.
Sorry, time's up.
So the two of us went to view this movie, and before it started, I said, "There's Jackie. We've got to go over and ask her how she remembers it." So we got her side of it, and the other person that was involved in this was a guitarist by the name of Jimmy Page.
The session people at this point, Big Jim Sullivan, who just died, was the main one.
Right, yeah.
And
John Paul Jones was one of the top bass players at the time. Jimmy Page was one of the top guitarists.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so it just so happened that last year, I think it was, just before Christmas, I was over in England at a luncheon event that my wife and I go to whenever we can. And Jimmy was there getting an award, so it was the perfect time. I went up, spoke with Jimmy, and hey, do you remember this situation? And he gave his side of it as well, and it was great because it pulled it all together. Because I saw it one way, Jackie saw it another, then Jimmy, the main part of it, he gave what we both remembered and pulled it together. And basically, the whole story was that we were recording this track. Jackie was very rhythmical with her acoustic guitar parts and everything. And I as this 16, 17-year-old at the time, remembered that we started the session and we had to take a tea break with the orchestra because the guitarist, who happened to be Jimmy Page, couldn't play the part. And she had to go down and spend the next 15, 20 minutes teaching him how to play the part that she had written. The orchestra came back in, and we got it. But that always fascinated me. The whole thing, he went on to become such a legend in Led Zeppelin, but he couldn't play this simple guitar part that Jackie DeShannon had written. Well, it turns out that what it was he wasn't a very good reader of music. And so the way it was written out, he could play it, but it just lacked the feel that she had intended. So she had to teach him how to play it with the feel that she wanted, and that's why we had to take the break. And it was amazing, just that whole thing of there are always three sides to the truth. There's yours, there's theirs, and there's the truth. And that's what we found out talking to the three of us. It was great.
And you don't think he was putting the hustle on her just by asking for personal?
I believe there was something.
There was something. Well, it happened after that, yes, but that happened right on the street. That was another time. Jackie also was the only person who did an entire tour with the Beatles here in the States, and she talked about George Harrison coming up and asking to show a couple different songs when I come in the room. So God bless her wherever she is right now.
Talking to Chris Carter.
I saw Chris this afternoon, but that's a story for the next lesson. You're working on Hard Day's Night as a button pusher, Beatles for Sale. They were touring, coming in and recording quickly.
Oh, yeah.
Was the attitude, damn it, we got to come in and do this, or were they still having fun?
Oh, no, they enjoyed being in the studio. I think they had more fun in the studio than they did anywhere else.
And Abbey Road, or EMI Recordings was then, and there's probably books in here about this, was a giant old house.
It was built in the 1860s.
Like most everything in that neighborhood.
Yeah, it's not a commercial neighborhood. It's all housing. A lot of old money there, almost sort of old Pasadena-ish, I guess. And people didn't like it being there, especially with the Beatles, with all the fans being outside and almost closing down the street, Abbey Road. People didn't like it. There's one story that I tell in the book how this was much later, I moved on to engineering by this time. I was working on the first Jeff Beck album called Truth. And on one track, we had Keith Moon come in to play Tim's. Now, Mooney had this Rolls Royce, and on the top of it, he had this PA system that he could just switch on at any time he wanted and pull out a microphone and talk to people. So here we are. We finished probably about 11, 12 o'clock at night, and he's pulling out of the car park in his roller, and this little old lady was walking her little dog, and she happened to step out in front of him as he was pulling out of the car park. He immediately pulls the mic, switches on the PA, and gives a tirade like I couldn't. There are 100 sailors I could pull in that couldn't even come out with as bad language as he used against this poor little old lady. Anyway, the complaints that came in at that time to Abbey Road, probably the worst they've ever been, and there have been a lot. But yeah, so it's a residential neighborhood.
And this is where all this creativity was going on behind the scenes. And Abbey Road, folks, is about the size, about as wide as this platform here. It's very small. That picture of them from walking across Abbey Road is barely 2 lanes.
Oh, the actual Abbey Road, yes. The studio isn't. The studio's become
so the screaming girl's outside. There's Ken inside. That's really
wanting to be outside.
The last album that you did with them, according to the book, as a button pusher was Rubber Soul, which is one of the most creative ones, but they were under immense pressure to get this thing recorded. Could you tell, like when Lennon came in to record in My Life, that's the name of it, isn't it? In My Life, yes. Could you tell how special that was when you were up there in the little room? Or we're just cranking things
Actually,
up?
by then I'd moved into the control room, so I was much more a part of it at that point. No, it was recording another album. It was you didn't really get that much change in them in the studio. They were happy. They wanted to experiment all the way along the line, and I was what I got from working at Abbey Road. Totally blessed that the training I got was the best you could possibly imagine. Working with someone like Norman Smith, who was the engineer for the first 6 albums by then, was amazing. He was incredible. Most people will listen to the albums and won't really hear sort of how much he changed each album. He was very much a motivator with them of moving forward and getting something different for each album. And
even more so than George Martin.
It was such a different time. The producer then, he was more involved in arrangements, let's say, than sound or anything like that. The only producer sort of up to that point that had anything to do with sound was Spector. And he became renowned for his sound. But other than that, no. There's a story when we were mixing Savoy Truffle, and I was doing it with George Harrison in number 2 control room, and George Martin had been in another studio with John or Paul or Ringo or someone, and he walked in as we were in the middle of mixing, and he turned to George Harrison and said, "It's very toppy, it's a lot of high end," and George just turned to him and said, "That's the way I want it." So, Mr. Martin, Sir Martin, Sir George just turned around and walked out. That was it. It was, yeah, the sound-wise was very much down to the engineer.
In studio number 2, number 1 is the biggest one. You put full orchestra and an aircraft carrier.
Yeah, they had, at one point, they had an orchestra of 200 and a choir of 200. So it shows you how big that place was. It was the biggest record recording studio in the world for a long time.
And number 2 was much smaller. It's still there. The ceiling is probably 30 feet at least.
Yeah. It's 2 stories, yeah.
And it's just a concrete room with a really steep stairs that would never pass California Ocean. But that's where you did most of the work with those guys.
Yeah, but you stand at the top. Every time whenever I go up to London, I try and go by Abbey Road, and when I stand at the top of those stairs, every time the hair on the back of my head stands up. It's a magical place. There's so much history there. It's number 1 studio was the last place that Glenn Miller and his orchestra ever did anything. They did a radio broadcast. Glenn Miller left after that. 2 days later, he got on a plane and was never seen again. So just lots of things like that. It's the most amazing place.
And in addition, the acoustics of the room, when you walk into it, not only does the room feel different, but it sounds different just being in there. So that's at least to my crisp ears. We have a limited amount of time, so I wanted to ask you about Mother Nature's Son, just the way you were describing here. A mighty fine book that everybody should have at least one copy of.
At least one.
At least one. And I'd show you how it looks when it's signed, but he hasn't signed this one yet, so don't want to wear you out beforehand. Mother Nature's Son. Was it a complicated recording session? Was all planned out?
Never. It was never planned out with Mother Nature's Son. They constantly wanted to experiment. They always wanted things to sound different. So right at the end of the corridor from number 2 studio was this staircase that went from the basement up to the top. So Paul wanted a different drum sound, so we sent him, and he was going to play drums on this because it's very simple. We set up the drum kit down the bottom of the staircase and set up mics like 2 stories up, which is where the control for number 2 was. And we recorded it that way, and that's what you hear. I can't remember what it is. It almost sounds like Tim's at one point, but it's that plus him playing, using a pencil on, I think it was Hiawatha was the book or something like that. Just bits and pieces like that. It was the most amazing training because I couldn't do anything wrong. As a trainee engineer, I couldn't do anything wrong. I could put, let's say we're recording piano, I could put completely the wrong mic, in completely the wrong place, completely screw with the EQ, and it would sound atrocious, but there was every chance that they could come in and say, it's awful, we're going to use it. It's amazing.
And when you were working with them, especially during the White Album, where the legend is that they were at each other's throats, and Lennon was beginning to drift off, and Yoko would come into the picture, and all these things going on, was it contentious?
No, there were moments. I have done a lot of the albums I have done took 2 weeks to record. At some point during those 2 weeks, the artistic temperament would come out and someone would lose their temper. It is the artistic temperament. We're going to put across what we want to put across. So when you spend 6 months on a project, which is what we did with the White Album, that's going to happen more than once. So yeah, there were moments, absolutely, but the whole story of it was so terrible the entire time. It's bullcrap. I'm sorry. and Yoko, in her defense, John was already pulling away. It didn't need Yoko coming in. They were all pulling away. It was like a bad marriage. They'd grown apart. They all wanted to go their own ways. So that was there, most definitely. You could tell that. You can tell it just by listening to the music on the album. But when all 4 of them were in the studio playing together, it was magic. It was the old band again and all of that. And Yoko was just a side part of that. She happened to come along when John was pulling away. She wasn't the cause of it. She was a part of it.
There are stories in here on a million songs and other things of that nature. It is unfortunate, although everything happens the way it's supposed to. The Beatles were the first ones to do so many things, including writing their own material and recording their own material, which was unheard of almost every place at that point in time, and touring too much and not getting paid enough. Well, I think that's pretty consistent all the way through. But then no one ever thought of maybe you should take a vacation for 6 or 7 months and get away from each other. That wasn't thought of.
The problem was that they had no idea how long it would go on for. There was a great BBC interview where they're talking to Paul and Ringo. And the interviewer says to Paul, well, how do you see this going? How long do you think it will last? And Paul said, well, we'd be lucky if it keeps going for 2 years. And John and I, we'd love to write musicals or something like that after the 2 years. Then they go to Ringo, and it's, what would you like to do after this? Oh, I'd like to open up a hairdressing salon after this. That was the thing. It was going to be like 2-3 years. So if you're working hard for 2-3 years without taking a break, that's okay. No one ever realized 50 years down the line we should still be talking about it.
So there's many, many stories about the Beatles in here, and I want to step into a different studio, a completely different complex. You had already mentioned you worked with Jeff Beck briefly, and at that point in time, Yardbirds were breaking up, and the manager who was also handling Yardbirds and whatnot, Peter Grant, was also working with Jeff Beck, I believe, wasn't he hanging around?
Well,
Or if I jump over...
No, well, Peter Grant actually was Mickey Most, a top English producer. It was his assistant. And Mickey had produced Hi Ho Silver Lining with
Yes.
Jeff, a single, which did very well. So then it came to the time to do the album, Truth. And Mickey, it wasn't his type of music, so he didn't turn up. His assistant did, Peter Grant, who then went on to manage. Exactly.
And Peter Grant's main thing was getting money out of people. And
So I
making sure
hear. Luckily, at that point, I didn't have to deal with that. But he didn't
So
get
then,
me down.
when Beck was so pissed off that the first Led Zeppelin album sounded so much like his, well, Peter Grant probably
Wonder
wasn't
why.
thankful. You also worked with the early Pink Floyd.
I worked with Floyd. I did the last single with Sid, and I remember doing the first track with Gilmore, but apparently I did more than just the one track, but I don't remember it.
Was Sid the most crisp person you've ever worked with?
Oh, he was fun.
And there's stories in the book. When you moved over, you did all the solo Beatles stuff. You involved in solo. Say that again. Just delete that off the tape. You worked with all the Beatles in a solo capacity at some point in time as well. Give Peace a Chance.
I didn't really work with Paul in a solo capacity. Other than
His loss.
he is a producer working with Mary Hopkins.
Mary Hopkins.
But yeah, with John I did Cold Turkey and Give Peace a Chance, mixed that. With George, All Things Must Pass. With Ringo, It Don't Come Easy.
And you were also around for some sessions with the Stones, like Moonlight Mile and Sway. Were the Stones actually there? Was that Paul Buckminster doing the...
Bucko did the arrangements.
So we can't get a direct
Jagger,
comparison.
No, Jagger came in, but it was... I don't know if it was a late night or an early morning, but he was completely wasted, whichever way it went. So
Well, those were the days.
yeah.
Speaking, the first time you ran into David Bowie, you were working with another great producer, Gus Dudgeon. You worked underneath him or around him or something, or was that?
EMI.
At EMI, yes.
He was the one that got me the job at Trident, my next studio, and I was supposed to have been working with Gus, but for whatever reason I didn't. He produced this one track by a singer called David Bowie. The track was Space Oddity, which became successful, so the record company then wanted an album, and David's original producer, Tony Visconti, took over to do the album, and I worked a lot on the album with Tony and David. Then came Man Who Sold the World, that was started off in another studio, then I did the overdubs and mixed, once again with Tony. Then, because I'd done 2 albums with David, he took a break because Man Who Sold the World wasn't successful. So
It sold tens of copies.
yeah, right, precisely. He came in to produce a friend of his, who later on became one of his fashion designers. But during the course of recording this thing that he was producing, in one of the many breaks that we had, I happened to mention to David that I wanted to move into production. And he said, I've just signed a new production deal. I've just signed a new management deal. They want to put me into the studio to record an album so that we can get a deal. I was going to produce it myself, but I don't know if I can. Will you co-produce it with me? Sure. Now, I will be 100% honest here. I thought, very nice guy, certain amount of talent, superstar. No, it's not going to be like it was with the Beatles, where the first thing I ever do, millions of people are going to hear, and so you have to be dead on. I thought, now I can actually learn what I'm doing properly with someone that no one's going to hear. So if I mess up, it doesn't matter in the slightest. And it wasn't until David came over to the house one evening prior to starting recording, we were going through material. Suddenly it's, oh my God, this guy is really talented. He might actually make it. Oh hell, here I go again, kind of thing. So, and that led to Hunky Dory and then Ziggy.
And before Hunky Dory was even released, you were recording Ziggy.
Yeah, 2 weeks, about 2-3 weeks after finishing Hunky Dory.
Now, one of the things with the Beatles, whatever happened in the studio, and they maybe try and screw it up even more to make it sound different, whatever happened, they were able to adapt, and they didn't come in with solid ideas all the time. But Bowie was was in complete control, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah.
He knew
Absolutely.
exactly.
Almost, yes.
One of the most-
He knew what he wanted. He didn't necessarily know how to get it. That was the thing.
One of the most fascinating, there's lots of little fascinating things in this which would look really good as you walk out the door with two of them on your... With the many stories that are in here, how many times did David Bowie record a vocal?
Wow, God, that was so hard. I think 95% of the vocals I did on the 4 albums, I co-produced with him. One take on every one of them.
One take.
One take.
This is it.
I'd get the level, we'd go back, we'd start at the beginning, and we'd go through, and that was it. I'm positive that's one of the reasons we still talk about Bowie and those recordings 40 years on. They're real, they're live, they are performances. They're not like the stuff today that's all pieced together and you auto-tune it and you moved around so it's perfectly in time. His performances, they're not perfect. They're pitchy in places, they're out of time in places, but they're real. They come from in here, and that's what it's all about. As far as I'm concerned, it has to come from in here to start with.
And much of the band led by Mick Ronson having to invent things. There's a story in here, we don't have time for it right now, but Mick Ronson writing these scores, he'd show up at the studio and go up in the bathroom for 15 or 20 minutes and come down with, well, the details are in the book, because I have to
But
read
no one needs to read it now, because Joe's already told the story.
perfect bathroom reading, you can set it down anytime.
So it's one in the bathroom, one in the bedroom, one on the coffee table. Yeah.
We're getting there, we're getting there. I wanted to touch on 2 other artists before we turn you loose, and turn these folks loose to Terry with little pieces as well. Around the time you're working with Bowie, I mentioned Gus Dudgeon. Elton John was another guy who seemed to have a bit of songwriting and performing talent.
Slightly, yeah.
You came into that as an assistant or somewhere along the line, Madman Across the Water.
Yeah, Robin Jeffrey Cable, the guy that started off with Elton, recorded all of his early stuff. Unfortunately, they recorded Madman, and then Robin was in a really, really bad car accident. We didn't even know if he'd live at the end of it. And of course, they were halfway through. They needed someone to take over Robin's role with Elton, amongst other things. And because I'd worked with Gus in the past, and it was him that got the job, finally I got to work with Gus again, and that was mixing Madman, which then led to 2 other albums. Well,
in working with Elton, I'm going to attempt to tie this together here.
You mean
Reginald, yes.
Reg Dwight.
At that point, still. And it was fascinating to me that you guys, especially if you were recording in the Honky Chateau or the, whatever it was called, the French Chateau. See, he said it much better than I. Get up in the morning and have breakfast, and Elton would go through lyrics and find something he liked and go over to the piano.
But Bernie Taupin, the lyricist, would go up to his room around about 8 o'clock every night, and it was to write. And he'd come down in the morning, and he'd bring this whole stack of papers, give them to Elton. And it was very communal. We were all in this one big room eating breakfast together, and Elton, as he's eating, would be... And once he'd finished, he'd go over to the piano with whichever ones he liked. And this one occasion, he went over there and he's looking at it, and within 10 minutes, he'd written Rocket Man. It was absolutely astounding.
And then once he would record, did he take more than 1 or 2 takes?
Yeah. It wasn't Bowie. No.
But once he was finished with his vocals and the
we
basic
didn't see him
music,
again.
you wouldn't see him again, and it was up to you and the band.
Yeah. Well, myself, Gus, and the band. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's amazing when you have talent.
But the amazing thing is, they all get bored. But one of the whole things with David, and one of the things with Elton, they didn't like being in the studio, which was the complete opposite of the Beatles. Yeah. They loved being there. They loved to experiment. Whereas David, he wanted out as fast as possible. That's what. When it came to mixing any of his albums, I think he came to mixing sessions for 2 of the tracks, maybe just 1. The rest of it was just me. With Elton, he would come. Once he'd finished, you wouldn't see him in the studio. When it came to mixing, he'd come by towards the end just to hear what Gus and I had done, and that was it.
I want to touch on one last artist before Lita comes up here and kicks me out of the building and makes me pay for my own parking.
You mean you haven't been given the freebie yet?
Nice.
The first time, you're welcome. That was under the bus. First time you heard Supertramp, what did you think?
Crap.
This became one of the most distinctive recordings in all of rock and roll history. Not that you were already involved with a bunch of them, and some of them aged very well. What changed your mind about Supertramp?
Seeing them live, strangely enough, because they weren't the greatest live band to start with. But it was due to the success of Bowie and several other people I worked with. I got a phone call from A&M Records asking me to mix a track that Supertramp had recorded. It was a track called Land Code, which I don't know if it was ever actually really issued. But I mixed it, and that was it. Then I got a phone call from A&M saying they'd like to record an album with you. I said, okay, send me some demos. And they sent me these demos, which were atrocious. There was a little bit of one verse. They would go into a totally different song, just a bit of a chorus, and it was all over the place. And this is ridiculous. And I was managed at the time by the owners of Trident Studios, and they brought in this American gentleman by the name of Jack Nelson, who he was coming up to me and saying, Ken, you've got to do this because A&M are really into this. You've got to do it. But I don't like it. It's terrible. It's crap. I don't want to do it. Ken, you've got to. They're really into it. I tell you what, I know they're just playing down somewhere on Wednesday. Let's go to that. That will be the final decision, okay? So we go, Jack and I are sitting together. As we walk out, he said, you know what, you're right, they're terrible, you mustn't do it. I said, you kidding? I got to do it, they're amazing.
And it turned into Crime of the Century, one of the greatest sounding albums ever, and there's the full story in there about how long it took and how much attention you were paying to detail and all that. You worked with when you were starting out, the first few years, you were working with some amazing producers, a little different in job description, as you said. Like George Martin. Did you learn anything from George that you carried with you, or did it take a long time to realize?
It took a long time for me to realize what I had actually picked up from George. I would, as a second engineer, I'd sort of sit there at times and think, what the hell is this guy doing? He doesn't appear to be doing anything. And it's only having walked in his footsteps and produced other acts and looking back on it, I realized that what he was doing was allowing talent to do what talent has to do, and that's create. And always knowing that if they go too far sort of to the left, you can always, hey guys, nudge them back a bit so that they're back on the straight and narrow kind of thing. But it took me ages to realize that that's what he was doing, and that I picked up on that, and I was doing the same kind of thing. It was amazing.
How about from Gus? What did you learn from him?
Not to wear flashy socks.
Okay.
Oh, no, there are too many things like, no. No, I honestly learned a lot from Gus.
Okay. And you also were working with engineers, especially when you were learning about how to work with the Beatles. And in the book, you detail where some of the technique, you are so well known for your sound, and there's jazz bands. He's worked with so many people that we don't have time to go into. That's why you need at least one copy of this. When Billy Cobham and the jazz guys and non-Vision Orchestra were talking about how incredible the sound was, you were just a rock and roll guy in your own mind, but you learned not so much microphone placement, I assume, because when you were starting working in EMI, that you said, I think you learned where to place the microphones from Jeff Emmerich, who learned from Norman Smith, and if anybody could remember.
We always followed on, to start off with, we always followed on the person that went before. And when Jeff took over from Norman, he followed what Norman did totally until he learned a bit more and got to experiment a bit. I was much the same way. I took over from Jeff, I followed what he did until I had so much time to experiment and learned, oh, I like these mics better and all of that kind of thing. So, yeah.
When did you realize, because I don't think you actually identified in the book itself, when did you realize that you have an honest-to-God gift for hearing things and how mixes should go, and their ears are next to your sense of calmness? Your ears.
I don't know that I've ever I do what I love to do. I always have. I was talking to someone yesterday. I said I think I've probably worked a maximum of a month during my life. I've just had fun. Bobby likes to tell this thing about how I can't accept albums that I've worked on as being classics and just how important they are and how they've affected people's lives. And it was yesterday that it suddenly occurred to me why it is that I have such a hard time with it. And it's, you take policemen, you take firemen, you take nurses, you take teachers. They have a calling. They go into their profession because they want to make a difference. I went into it because I wanted to make music and have fun. And that's been my life. And because I don't have that same calling as them, I'm having fun. It's, how can I accept that I've impacted people's lives when I've just been having fun?
Well, we're blessed that you have that gift. There was one other extremely important question. Oh, one thing we didn't touch on. Okay, you work with all these artists.
Wrote to Ziggy Stardust.
So the sign from Ziggy Stardust, the album Quest, K-West is for sale. No, it's not for sale. It's on display in London. We'll go into that later. You worked with the Beatles. What was your favorite song working with the Beatles, or was it all a big mishmash?
I love Happiness Is a Woman. It's such a bizarre.
And when it comes to Bowie, what song stands out for Bowie?
Oh, there are a few. Life on Mars, probably. I give talks to universities and I break down multi-tracks. And one of the ones that I do is Life on Mars, and just hearing Rick Wakeman's piano on its own every time is absolutely phenomenal.
He's got several others, if you ever have a chance, where he's doing the full-on presentation, breaking down. Is there a favorite Supertramp song?
No. I won.
Okay.
I love Asylum.
Asylum. Okay.
Like the story of that?
Yes.
Very, very briefly. Because of working with Bowie, we didn't have automation back then when we were mixing. So when I started mixing Hunky Dory, it was just me. Sometimes there was a second engineer there with me. I wanted to make changes between verses and choruses and all of this. And there was no way I could do it just all by myself. So I got into this habit of just mixing a very short section, getting it exactly the way I wanted it, cutting it out, putting it to one side. Then I'd move on to the next part. Let's say I got the intro. Then I moved on to the first verse. I'd get that right, cut it out, put it onto the intro, make sure that worked, put it to one side. And I worked through the entire song just doing all of these sections. So I even did this with Supertramp. We recorded, I think Crime was 16 track, but on every track there must have been like 15 different instruments. It was madness. And so even with everyone sort of having their knobs to turn at given points during the mix, we still had to do it in short sections. So, Asylum. Rick Davis, whose song it was, he had to go to the theatre or something the night we were mixing it. So he left it to the rest of us. And we went through it and we were piecing it together, and we got it about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. We were finished. We blasted it so loud. It was amazing. We were in seventh heaven. We went home and came in the next day, and Rick came in and he said, "Okay, let's hear it." He said, "It's great. You're going to love it. Sit down, sit down." Put him in the centre so he could hear it properly, and we played it to him. And at the end of it, he's just, it's good. But why did you leave out the section at the end where I do this? What do you mean, the section you did? It's there. No, it's not. We go back, and we had missed a complete section at the end of it. Now, the ridiculous side of this is that it had probably taken a day and a half to set up the actual mix, all of the EQ, the echoes, everything. It took a day and a half to get it. But of course, I'd finished the mix, so I stripped everything down, so we didn't have any of that. And it probably took me half an hour to set it up all again, just to do that section. And you can't, I guarantee no one can hear the difference between a day and a half section and a half an hour section.
When you go out and see a band live,
Rarely these days, but
I was going to say, is it a pain if
No.
the mix?
sometimes.
Sometimes, okay. We got time for a couple of questions?
Absolutely.
Yes.
I want to know between when you started and now, what would you say is the recording industry's greatest gain? What's the greatest loss?
The greatest gain is Pro Tools, the greatest loss is Pro Tools. We as humans, we always take everything too far. I use the analogy of the wah-wah pedal. The first time I ever heard a wah-wah pedal was, oh wow man, that's cool, yeah. Then 2 weeks later when it's on every bloody record that you hear on the radio, it's, oh man, that's bloody awful. And it's like that with Pro Tools. It's digital is amazing. It has there are so many amazing things you can do within the digital domain. But analog is great as well. There are so many things that analog can give you that you can't get from digital. So why do we have to have it as being one or the other? Why can't it be? We use both. Plus the other thing is that Pro Tools, the good side of it is that it can help people that have great talent but would never get the opportunity to put that talent forward for people to hear. It enables them to do that, but it also enables a lot of people that have no talent whatsoever to put their stuff forth as well, which isn't good. So yeah, it's Pro Tools is the good and the bad.
Pro Tools, you can do 607 takes.
Yeah.
You have to decide which one you want.
Yeah, and that's why it takes 3 years between albums now.
Another question? Yes.
Yes.
What are you working on now, besides the book, musically? What are you working on? And
Is there anything in life but Abbey Road to Ziggy Stardust? No, it's...
and have you ever thought about doing another album the same old way with the section?
Oh, I think about it all the time. No, I've recently been in with a young band called Fallen Riviera from South Bay. I did one track with them. I'm going to go in next week and do another track with them. I really like them. I had a blast. Bobby, my co-writer, was producing a band called Snow, SNEW, a hard rock band. And he said, hey, you love being in the studio, do you want to come in and engineer for me? I said, yeah, great. So I love doing that. I love being in the studio. It's as soon as I'm done with this, I've got to get back in the studio. Absolutely. That's my second one.
One of us?
Oh. now is this a joke?
Do you ever have to convince David Bowie of performance over perfection?
Oh no, the complete opposite. He would do a tape, and when you're first going through it, there were occasions when you think, oh, there's a mistake, we're going to have to go in and patch that up. And he'd come up, we'd go through it, and you hear it the second time when you're expecting it, and it's, no, hang on, that works perfectly kind of thing. So it was along those lines. He never had, no, we're keeping that, forget it kind of thing. It was just that second hearing when you're expecting he did something you weren't expecting. Then you realise that, yeah, that works.
I was just looking for a Procol Harum story.
Oh, gee, oh, okay, well, there's
Procol Harum was a band from the 60s that didn't get along well, and it took them 34 years to file suit over who actually wrote the song that they sold those copies of. And then I think somebody died, and it doesn't matter. So.
I know Gary's still around, I know Matthew's still around, so
no Christmas cards between them.
Yeah, I don't think
Okay, I'm sorry, that's not the story we're looking for.
the only one I can think of offhand, I did an album with them called Assaulted Dog. And it was...
They make you go out and record the sound of the sea?
No. That was from this metal cabinet that had all the EMI sound effects. No. We were mixing it. There was the producer, who was Matthew Fisher, who was also the organist. There was Gary Brooker, and there was myself. And we've mixed it, and we've all three sort of sitting there listening to it. Now, it just so happened at that point we all had long hair and beards. And we're sitting there listening to it, and suddenly Matthew's girlfriend, who was sitting in the back, burst out laughing. And we were really pissed off. What the hell are you doing? We're serious here, we're listening. And she said, you were all sitting there, and in perfect time, you were all going...
That's a Procol story.
So with all the artists you've worked with and all the albums you've been involved with, has any of them ever given you as much joy as having this book available at this point in time? Really? Oh, okay. Should have topped that. Okay, yeah.
I was just wondering if you had a favorite artist that you...
No, it's... I liken it to your kids. They all have their good points, they all have their bad points, but we love them all equally, supposedly.
You spent a lot of time with George Harrison before.
Oh, yeah, he was amazing. Incredible human being, one of the funniest people that I've ever met. Very, very talented, unlike certain stories that one reads. No, he was something else. And I was blessed to spend a fair amount of time with him shortly before his passing. I was staying at his English home, Friar Park, and I was there the last time he was ever there. And we walked around and he was looking. And although in hindsight, I'm positive that he knew he wouldn't be going back there again. And he was just taking everything in. And just looking back on that, for me, it's a very moving experience.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ken Scott.